one of the problems with doing this the way we do is we really can't go in as in depth as I would like to go, which could be a good thing because some of the stuff you can do there are entire courses in college you do just on one of these things. But so this is session 5. We're looking at transmission and translation. Last week we talked about inspiration, inerrancy, infallibility, what those terms mean, how we need to understand them so that we can apply them meaningfully. This week we're going to look at issues of transmission and translation and why it's necessary to understand these things. So all this stuff from all the way down, it all fits together, whether you believe it or not. But I hope next week, when we go into actual interpretation and application, we'll kind of see how it all fits together. But primarily, it's because the enemies of our faith use our own ignorance against us, and they'll use the ignorance of His authority. They'll abuse inerrancy, and if we're not prepared, we can't give the answer that we're supposed to give. We'll be caught flat-footed. Of course, Paul, writing in Ephesians, instructs us to put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, we are to take up the whole armor of God, that we may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Having fastened the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, as shoes on our feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace, in all circumstances, taking up the shield of faith, which we can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance. We're to arm ourselves, not with literal swords or guns, but ultimately with everything that God provides in His Word. Because that is the foundation. Everything else depends upon it. The Bible begins with the presupposition that God created all things, God defines all things, and man's response should be to recognize God's authority. But what are some of the attacks that come at us that we need to keep alert and persevere for? We kind of eased into this gentleman right here, Dr. Bart Ehrman, UNC Chapel Hill. He's one of their. He's actually a decent scholar. In his scholarly works, his popular works are trash, and pulp. But his this rebuttal from his debate with Dr. Michael Licona on the New Testament, I think captures so much of the opposition. So it crystallizes it where we can see it. So I want you to listen to it. I want you to, and of course there you get a place to take some notes. If you need to, you can write on the back of a page. I want you to listen to what he says and just we'll talk about it after it's finished. It's about 10 minutes.
Historians have to have evidence.
If I can get it to play.
Historians have to have evidence. Well, what kind of evidence do they look for? The best kind of evidence when dealing with ancient periods is to find evidence that goes back to the time itself. If you have some contemporary eyewitnesses telling you how Simon Peter died, that would be brilliant. Unfortunately, you don't have that. You would love, though, to have contemporary accounts written like the next day from the events. That would be great. Historians would love that kind of thing. Historians would love to have lots of sources. You want to have lots of sources that go back to the time of the events that are being narrated. You would like these sources to be independent of one another. If you have 20 sources, but they all got their story from the same guy, then you don't have 20 sources, you have one source. You want 20 independent sources who all attest the same event. Moreover, you want these independent sources to be consistent with one another. You don't want them to be contradicting each other all over the map. You want them to be agreeing with one another. So you want them to corroborate one another without collaborating with one another. Moreover, you want them to be unbiased toward the subject matter. You don't want them to be spewing things in light of their own self-interest. If you're an ancient historian trying to establish what probably happened in the past. What kind of sources do we have when it comes to the Gospels? The Gospels are our sources for knowing about the resurrection of Jesus. Are they the kind of sources that historians would want when trying to establish what probably happened in the past? I think the answer to that question is no. When were the Gospels written? Well, they are not contemporary to the events they narrate. Scholars debate when the Gospels were written, but by far the most common datings are that Mark was written sometime around 65 or 70 A.D., Luke and Matthew about 10 or 15 years later, John maybe 10 or 15 years later, and John maybe around the year 90 or 95, Matthew and Luke around 80 to 85. These are the dates that are taught throughout the universities and divinity schools and seminaries of North America. In Europe, I take them to be right for reasons that I can give you if anybody really wants to know. It's a complicated argument. If these dates are correct, it means that our earliest account of Jesus' resurrection is 40 years after the event. 40 years after the event. Well, Paul was writing before that, wasn't it? Yes, Paul was writing before that. Paul talks about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians. Well, that's 20 years after the event. So that's better. The Gospels give us the narratives. Paul makes reference to it, but there's a 20-year gap. You don't have somebody who was there writing about it. Second point. None of the authors were eyewitnesses. Paul himself indicates that he was not an eyewitness, and none of the gospel writers was an eyewitness. People, of course, call the gospel books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, they call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because we don't know who wrote these books, and there's no point calling them Sam, Fred, Jerry, and Harry. I mean, they're written by people we don't know who they were written by. They are anonymous. You might not think so because they have the title, The Gospel According to Matthew. Whoever put that title on it was an editor later. The original books are all anonymous, written in the third person. Moreover, the followers of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking peasants from Galilee, lower-class men who were not educated. In fact, Peter and John in Acts chapter 4, verse 13 are literally said to be illiterate. They couldn't read and write. Of course not. They were fishermen. They didn't go to school. The vast majority of people in the ancient world never learned to read, let alone write. And their native language was Aramaic. These books are written in Greek by highly educated, rhetorically trained writers who are skilled in Greek composition. Probably not disciples and don't claim to be disciples. Where did these authors get their stories from? Well, if they were not disciples of Jesus, they must have heard the stories from somebody. Who heard the stories from somebody, who heard the stories from somebody, who heard them from somebody. Stories about Jesus, including his resurrection, had been in circulation year after year after year from the time that his disciples knew that he got killed and believed he got raised from the dead. They told stories to convert people. They improved the story sometimes. They changed the story sometimes. The stories got modified in the process of transmission over the course of decades before anybody wrote the stories down. These stories are based on oral reports that have been in circulation for decades. What happens to oral reports in circulation year after year, decade after decade? They get changed. What evidence do we have that the stories about Jesus' death and resurrection got changed? You can read the stories yourself. Simply read Mark's account of Jesus' death and then read John's account of Jesus' death and make a list of everything that happens in both and compare your lists. You will find that there are stunning differences. In fact, there are discrepancies. Let me give you just a list of very quick examples. What day did Jesus die on? That's a simple question. And luckily, we're told in both Mark and John. In Mark's Gospel, we're told that Jesus died the day after the Passover meal was eaten in Jerusalem. John tells us explicitly, chapter 19, verse 14, that Jesus died the day before the Passover meal was eaten, on the day of preparation for the Passover. That's different. He couldn't die both days. What about the time? According to Mark, he died at 9 in the morning. According to John, he wasn't condemned to death until afternoon. John 19:14. These are accounts that differ from one another. Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way to Golgotha, or did Simon of Cyrene carry it? It depends which gospel you read. Did both robbers mock Jesus, or did only one of them mock him and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died, or was it after he died? It depends which gospel you read. I can give you the references for all of these if you need me to, or you can look them up yourself. I'm not making these up. Those are just differences about Jesus' death. What about differences in the accounts of his resurrection? Well, who went to the tomb on the third day? Did Mary Magdalene go alone, or did Mary go with other women? Depends which gospel you read. If with other women, how many of them were there? What were their names? And which ones were they? It depends which gospels you read. Was the stone rolled away before the women got to the tomb or not? What did they see in the tomb? Did they see a man? Did they see two men? Or did they see an angel? Depends which gospel you read. What were they told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to stay in Jerusalem to see Jesus, or were they supposed to go to Galilee? Depends which gospel you read. Did the women tell anybody, or were they silent about it? Depends which gospel you read. Did the disciples ever leave Jerusalem? Or did they never leave, or did they leave and go to Galilee? Depends which gospel you read. My conclusion, these are not reliable historical accounts. There are too many discrepancies. The accounts are based on oral traditions that have been in circulation for decades. Year after year, Christians try to convert others by telling them stories to convince them that Jesus was raised from the dead, and they change their stories while trying to convince people. These authors were not eyewitnesses. They're Greek-speaking Christians living many years after the fact. They're telling stories that Christians have been telling all these years. There was nobody there taking notes. Some of the stories were invented, many were changed. For this reason, these accounts are not as useful as historians would like as historical sources. What I've given you so far is really just kind of child's play compared to the real problem of why historians cannot prove the resurrection. And this is what I want to spend my last 3.5 minutes on, the real problem. Mike and I agree that what historians try to do is establish what most probably happened in the past. That is the task of history. You can't prove the past. You can only give evidence for the past, and some evidence is more certain than other evidence. All the historian can do is show most probably what happened. What are miracles? Miracles, by definition, are the least probable occurrence of an event. If a miracle was not least probable, it wouldn't be a miracle. If somebody could walk across the lukewarm water in your swimming pool, that would be a miracle. If the water was frozen, it would not be a miracle. But if it's lukewarm, I can tell you, none of you here can do it, and nobody in this world could do it. That's 6 billion people, so what are the chances of one person being able to do it? It would defy the way nature naturally works. I'm not saying that there are natural laws that are written down someplace that you can't break or you get in big trouble. Scientists today don't talk about natural laws, but scientists do talk about highly predictable ways that this world works. And one of the ways it works is that if you are a sentient human being trying to walk across the lukewarm water in your swimming pool, you won't be able to do it. What if somebody could do it? What would be the chances? The chances would be infinitesimally remote that anybody could do it. Well, what if somebody could? Okay, let's say somebody could. The chances of them being able to do it are infinitesimally remote. Can you prove that this person probably did it? No, you can't prove it because you can't repeat the experiment of the past to show he did it. That's the problem with history. It's not like the natural sciences. The natural sciences work by repeated demonstration. And so, for example, if I wanted to show you that bars of iron will sink in that swimming pool and bars of ivory soap will float, all I need to do is to get 100 bars of both and start chucking them in. I'll chuck in 100 bars of iron, they'll sink every time. I'll chuck in the soap, they'll float every time. That gives us a predictive probability of what will happen the 101st time. That's how sciences work, by repeated experimentation. Historians don't have that luxury. Historians can only establish on the basis of surviving evidence what probably happened in the past, and by definition, miracles are the least probable occurrence, or else they're not a miracle. This creates the dilemma for the historian and is the reason why historians cannot prove Jesus was raised from the dead. Historians, by their very nature, establish what most probably happened in the past, but a miracle, by its definition, is the least probable occurrence in the past. The least probable occurrence cannot be most probable. This is the problem with the resurrection. Even if it happened, it defies imagination and cannot be accepted as a historically proven event. Belief in the resurrection. If you believe in the resurrection, it is for theological reasons. The resurrection is a theological assertion about what God did to Jesus. It is not, and it cannot be, based on historical proof. Thank you.
All right. So I want you to see the whole thing, just so you kind of see where he's standing. But just kind of simply put, what are some of the problems that he identifies? Just with the Gospels. I mean, we can take some of what he says to the Gospels and expand to the whole Bible. But what are the primary problems that he identifies?
So is this guy supposed to be somebody that's a genuine believer, or is he doubtful? I mean, I get the impression he doesn't believe anything about the Bible.
Oh, he doesn't. He's the
opposite side. He's the anti.
Yep.
Okay.
So
I just want to make sure that I can figure out why he's so mad.
He calls himself a happy agnostic. I don't think he's happy, and I don't think he's an agnostic.
10 minutes about all I like to stand of hearing that.
But I want you to listen to. Did you notice the presupposition that he had running? That if it was truly historical, it would have been early? Well, why does it have to be early to be truly historical? That's begging the question. Why did it have to be written the very next day to be historical? Why couldn't it have been written 30 years later and still be historical? He's taking modern standards and applying them to the past. And that's not how ancients thought. So we have to check our presuppositions at the door and realize what we're dealing with. But anything else that just kind of jumped out at you? It's a D word. He likes throwing it around.
Discrepancies.
Discrepancies. Yes. We'll talk about why there are discrepancies. Now some of what he brought up, we'll talk about next week. Or no, we got business meeting next week, don't we? So week after. But sometimes discrepancies are products of what we're going to talk about tonight. So, when we pick up our Bibles, the inspired, inerrant, infallible Word of God, we have to ask ourselves a question. What exactly are we looking at? As I said, it did not come to us this way. It did not float down from heaven on a silk pillow with leather binding and gold-trimmed edges and thumb index. It came through time. And there are throughout time, there have been three types of inspiration that have been discussed, which kind of goes back to last week, but I wanted, because it deals with going into translation also. The first one is ipsissima verba, the very words. These are the very words that God gave. And this is often, when people think of inspiration, this is what they think of. Well, there's a second one that kind of goes along with it. They'll say, well, it wasn't the word so much as it was the voice, ipsissima vox, the very voice. So we're not hearing the exact words, but we're hearing the voice. So it's not verbatim. It's what the writer understood Jesus or God to be saying. But then we have those instances where God is speaking directly, where Jesus is speaking very directly. And so there's a third one that kind of levels everything out, called ipsissima intendibant, the very intention. And this form of inspiration gives the writers the freedom. They can be giving direct quotations. They can be giving their understanding. That the voice can be there. Everything can be there in one unit. Because this is what we're intended to have. It goes to what Paul says in 2 Timothy when he says all Scripture is breathed out by God for correction, for reproof, for teaching, for training in righteousness. All those things fit together. But this is what the skeptic will point to in that. In fact, there are differences of perspectives, and we see the personality of all authors. We see what's important to them. So, but then they'll point to this. Once again, our famous graphic here. The oldest version of the Bible in the world is Sinaiticus. And there's 14,800 differences between this Bible and the standard King James Version. Like I said last week, commits category error first. But this text is very important. I guarantee that, number one, the person who created this could not tell you what the differences are or why they matter. He probably doesn't even know what Codex Sinaiticus contains, which is, number one, probably it was some of the earliest evidence for the Septuagint, which has some very interesting readings in it. It also contains non-canonical works, Shepherd of Hermas, things like that, books you probably heard of. But they were there. So this was important to them, and they had it written down. But it's also interesting because it's probably one of the Bibles, what would become the Bible, that Constantine commissioned before his death, following the Council of Nicaea. So this is probably something from that time period. But it's very important. And of course, just to kind of cover some ground again, when I've previously mentioned that all this was done by hand. So it was very labor intensive. And we know we can find out just how labor intensive it was because the men copying these texts, when they would get to the end of it, they would insert something called a colophon, which is just this is all I've got. This is all I'm doing. I'm done with this. Some of them are very colorful. Some of them are poetic. Some of them are just like the end and done, copied by John. But this process was expensive. It was very expensive. Often, it could cost a month's wages to produce a single text like this. Just a one page. But we've talked about dating. And if you were paying attention to Dr. Ehrman's presentation, the dating actually conflicts with some of his statements if we just look and listen. I mean, 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul writes to Timothy, "When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all the parchments." And what's interesting is, and Dr. Michael Kruger of Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, also from North Carolina, points out that the words that are translated books was a common word used to refer to Old Testament texts. And that the word translated parchments is a word that was used to refer to personal journals, which usually contained letters both to and from a writer. I mean, what's interesting is when we see collections of Paul's writings, when we find evidence of them in history, they're almost always together. But he didn't write most of his letters were to specific churches. Corinth, Galatians, the church of Galatia, the Thessalonians. All of these letters, but almost always they show up together. They show up in collections together. Well, how did they get that way? If he wrote to one specific church, to Corinth or to Colossae or to Philippi, how did they all wind up together? This is probably how they did it. Because Paul would keep copies of his letters. So that, let's say, he sent a letter to somebody and something happened to it, he would have a copy of it. And they'd write him back, "Have you written anything lately? Your letter was messed up." We actually find in history where somebody will receive a letter from someone that said, "I got your letter, but the last few pages of it seem to be missing." So they would write out the letter again and send it. So there was we find this in history. If we take a look at just the New Testament alone, we take what Ehrman says, what he says about the New Testament, about the problems he has with it. Maybe Luke's gospel was in some of those parchments because Paul quotes Luke in 1 Corinthians. Paul also quotes Matthew and quotes it as scripture to Timothy. So maybe some of that is in these writings. I mean, maybe even John's gospel. Maybe that would put John's gospel very early. Most scholars like today did around 90. But what if it was written around 70? Because there's a very small level of scholars who want to put it earlier than 70, probably 65. But what if those texts were in there? What if Paul had copies of that? What if he had a copy of 1 Peter? What would become known to us as 1 Peter? But when we look at the New Testament, some of the problems, we call them problems, or Ehrman seems to think they're problems, is the fact that it's about 139,000 words out of about 24,000 manuscripts. If we look at there's about 6,000, it floats between 5,700 and 5,900. Very early manuscripts. The number shifts and changes. Between these, we have textual variation. And the number is almost always given as 400,000 variants. But a recent survey about 5 years ago would put the number around 500,000, which would put you between, which some people say, a choice of 3 to 4 words per page, and that or per word. Because you go, there's 139,000 words, and you've got almost 500,000 variants. You know, what were these people writing? Well, Ehrman will take that and run with it. But there's a problem. He's misrepresenting the problem. So I'm going to let Dr. White explain.
99% of all variants, I could not even explain. 99% of all variants, I could not even explain to you in the English language because they do not impact the meaning or translation of the text. They have to do, for example, with word order. And in the Greek language, word order is very different than it is in English. It has been well said that there are about 16 different ways that you could write something like Paul loves the church or Jesus loves his people in the Greek language as far as word order and utilization of different cases and tenses and all sorts of things like that. And so when you have variations along those lines that cannot be translated into other languages, then they're not impacting the actual meaning of the text itself. But what's more is there's all sorts of spelling issues. For example, I remember when I took first year Greek, one of the students in the Greek class we had really struggled with the concept of the movable nu. The movable nu is just basically the same thing as we have in English. You're not supposed to say a apple. You're supposed to say an apple. You're supposed to put that extra N in there when you have a word starting with a vowel afterwards, right? Well, some people don't quite get that, and some scribes didn't quite get that. And the same thing is true in Greek as well. And that is that there are those words, you're supposed to have the movable nu. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. That accounts for literally thousands of variants of that 400,000. And so 99% of them are simply inconsequential. They do not in any way impact the meaning of the text. So 1% of 400,000 is about 4,000 meaningful textual variants out of 138,162 words. It's about 2.9%, or one meaningful variant every 3 pages. But only about half of these are viable. What does viable mean? Well, if you had a scribe who got up one morning and he didn't have his coffee, and he stepped on his cat on the way out to the scriptorium. And he forgot his glasses. Well, okay, let's not use glasses. That's a little bit anachronistic. But he's having a bad day, and so he's not paying attention to what he's copying. And so in the process of copying a manuscript,
his mind wanders, and he comes up with a reading that no one's ever seen before. And this is in the 14th century. If you find one manuscript in the 14th century, it has a reading that no one's ever seen before. It's not viable. That means it doesn't go back to the early period. It could not be the original reading. In fact, we have one manuscript where one scribe had a really bad day because the text he was copying was written in 2 columns, but he forgot it was written in 2 columns. And so he just copied straight across, and it was in the genealogy of Jesus. And it really becomes weird because then God ends up with a father named Phares, and it's really, really strange. And this guy somehow didn't even notice this. I don't know how that happened, but we still have the manuscript. We still have the evidence that there were scribes who sometimes just were not really aware of what in the world was going on. And so that could happen. So only about half, or a little less than half, of these are viable. They actually go back far enough, they have enough manuscript evidence behind them that they could possibly represent the original. So that comes up with about 1,500 to 2,000 viable New Testament textual variants. That is a very, very different picture than what we were given before when you talk about 400,000 variants and more variants than there are words and all the rest of that kind of stuff. We're talking about 1,500 to 2,000 instead. Now, we still need to understand that. Simple fact, the more manuscripts you have for a work of antiquity, the more variants you're going to have. Think about it. If you only have one manuscript, how many variants do you have? None. Now, a lot of us would sort of like if that's the way it was. No manuscripts at all. We have the one master manuscript. What's the real problem with that? You have to trust that whoever made that one manuscript got it absolutely right. And if you don't have anything else, if you don't have anything to check that by, you've got no way to get back to the original. You have no way of testing whether that one scribe was having a bad day or not. So having just one manuscript, bad thing. For any work of antiquity, the more manuscripts you have that you can compare, the better off you are and the better certainty you have of still possessing the original readings. But the downside to that is the more manuscripts you have, the more variants you have. So while we have a large number of variants, it's just because the New Testament has more manuscripts than any other work of antiquity at all. So it's just a logical thing. I really struggle. I try to explain this to my Muslim friends because they think, well, I've got the Quran and there's no variants. Well, there actually are. They're just not aware of them. And we've all got one Arabic text and we can all look at one Arabic text and that's superior to what you have. But the reality is it isn't. That's not superior. It's actually an inferior transmission methodology to what we have in the New Testament. And so think about it. If there are more than 5,700 cataloged manuscripts of the New Testament, the average length of which is at least on the low end 200 pages, it could be as much as 400 pages depending on how you count pages. That's at least at the very, very low end 1.3 million pages of text, and some would say upwards to 3 million pages of handwritten text. That's a lot of pages of text. Now when you think about it, 1,500 to 2,000 meaningful and viable variants over minimally 1.3 million pages of hand-copied text, spanning approximately 1,500 years prior to the invention of printing, is an amazingly small percentage of the text, reflecting an amazingly accurate transmission of the text. In fact, one might almost call it downright miraculous.
I've used this earlier, of course, to kind of put things in perspective. So, some discrepancy, we're going to call that, that's going to be our word of the day. Some discrepancies are simply the result of the transmission of the text. Simply the result of it coming through history. But it's not distortion. And that's something that's important. Now, Richard Bentley, in a book called Remarks upon a Discourse of Free Thinking, I find that strangely ironic, especially considering the number of people who call themselves free thinkers today aren't really. 1713, he says, if there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament, at the restoration of learning about 2 centuries ago, then we would have no various readings at all. And would the text be in a better condition then than now that we have 30,000 now? This is 1713, so he's got 30,000 variant readings. It is good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. First, we have to establish some context for his comments. When he's referring to the restoration of learning, is there any idea of what he's referring to? It's okay. I mean, he's referring to what would become the Enlightenment. But the reason why it became the Enlightenment is we have to understand something a little bit about world history. In 1077, what would become the Roman Church and the Eastern Orthodox split and became 2 separate entities. As a result of that split, in the West, Latin became the primary language of scholars, and it became the primary language of transmitting the biblical text because of Jerome's work. Well, Greek continued to be the language of scholarship in the East. Well, something else happened in that time period. Any guesses? Something you see mentioned on the news a lot lately. Starts with an I. Islam. Islam began its rise. And so Greek became very limited in its reach. It began to be concentrated around Constantinople, Greece, northwestern Turkey. And so you have Islam expand between the 7th and 10th centuries. Lands that had been previously dominated by Christians. What's interesting is that you have 2 traditions. You have what is known as the Byzantine text tradition, and you have the Alexandrian text tradition. It just simply refers to the style of writing and how they phrased things. But you had these 2 traditions. Well, when Islam came up and began its expansion, the Alexandrian was almost wiped out. So all we have is the Byzantine. Well, in the 16th century, in the late 15th, early 16th century, the Ottoman Turks finally overran Byzantium, finally took Constantinople. The Greek scholars fled to the west, bringing with them all of their knowledge of Greek. And so Greek, because of this sudden influx of these scholars, Greek became the language of scholarship once again. But notice what he says. You know, we have 30,000 variant readings. And he thought, and he's saying, and he's confident about this. This is his confidence. We've got 30,000 variant readings. We can be confident in our text. You're going, wait a second. You have variant readings, but of course, going back, what are those variations? Most of them are spelling, things like that. I said, what are we talking about when we talk about? We're talking about spelling. Of course, he mentioned the movable nu. And also, this is interesting. How do you spell John? You spell it with one N or two. Greeks didn't. They spell it with two because they spelled phonetically. That's another problem. You might have something that in one place it's spelled with one L, another place it's spelled with two. We didn't have standardized spelling like we do now. So people would they would sound words out. Word order, of course, is an issue, but this comes as a problem of geography because people in one area may have one way of phrasing things. People in another area may have another way of phrasing things. Greek is a wonderful and flexible language, and the original authors could tailor their message, and they could put stress on words by how they phrase things. And of course, a scribe who's making a copy, he might realize, well, the way this is phrased isn't going to make sense to people where I'm at. So I need to rephrase it so they'll understand it. Doesn't change the meaning of what was said, just change how it was being said. But then you've got additional problems, which become later. The example that was given, the error of sight, where a text was 2 columns was written as 1. You also had when Christianity became a legal religion in the Roman Empire, Constantine removed all the barriers, all the elements that had previously made Christianity illegal, and basically established freedom of religion in the Roman Empire. As manuscripts began to be produced, there were things created called scriptoriums. And what you would do is you'd have one person sitting there reading the text and 15 or 20 other people copying it as he's reading it. Well, of course, one of the problems that comes out is errors of hearing. He may say one word, but you hear another. That sometimes happens. And of course, then you have what happened before Christianity was legalized, what we call errors of persecution. And this is one of those interesting, kind of weird things. Well, what do you mean an error of persecution? Well, we have a report from the Romans right around 300 AD, during the heaviest part of empire-wide persecution against Christians. A report from a Roman centurion. They went into a Christian church. They removed and destroyed 300 manuscripts. Now the question is, how many of those manuscripts have been memorized by the people who were in that church? Who knew what the text said, and then after it was destroyed, endeavored to recreate it by writing down what they could remember. This is what's called an error of persecution, because during persecution, if your manuscript was destroyed, if your text was destroyed, you did whatever you could to try to reconstitute it. So you might have it divided up in the memories of 3 or 4 people, and then you all get together and you write it out. What does this mean in regards to translation? So, none of us speak either Hebrew or Koine Greek. We might be able to read a little bit of it and get some of the grammar down. But the fact that we don't speak these languages, we're dependent upon translation. Going back to Article 10 from the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, we affirm that inspiration, strictly speaking, applies only to the autographic text of Scripture, which in the providence of God can be ascertained from available manuscripts with great accuracy. We further affirm that copies and translations of Scripture are the Word of God to the extent they faithfully represent the original. We deny any essential element of Christian faith is affected by the absence of the autographs. We further deny that this absence renders the assertion of biblical inerrancy invalid or irrelevant. But we're going to need to look at the second part of that affirmation. We affirm that copies and translations of Scripture are the Word of God to the extent they faithfully represent the original. So what does that mean to us where we are? Well, we have to ask what we're expecting of a translation. Which, I mean, Article 10 pretty much squares it out. We expect a faithful representation so that we can be complete, equipped for every good work. So, when it comes to the issue of translation, we have a bunch to choose from. King James, New King James, New International, New American Standard, New Living Translation, Living Bible, ESV, the Message, Holman Christian Standard Bible, Revised Standard Version, or its newest update, the New Revised Standard Version. And this is just not all of them. This is just what you'll find at most bookstores. And every one of them is different. Well, that means we need to understand what goes into a translation. We can take the phrase, which is German, Morgenstunden hat gelten Munden. Now, this doesn't really probably mean anything to you.
Why does it have to be in German?
Well, just for example, you can read it. But it's a common phrase in German. It literally translates to, morning hours have gold or money in their mouths. Well, that really doesn't make sense either. What would we say in English? The early bird catches the worm. This demonstrates what goes in translation. We have two distinct types of translation. We have literal translation. Morning hours have gold or money in their mouths. And what we would say, as English over here in the United States, early bird catches the worm. So I have two examples of translation right there. I have a literal word-for-word translation and what is called formal equivalence. What it would mean to us. But you notice even when I did the literal translation, I had to kind of clarify it. Gold or money. So the problem isn't necessarily meaning or the thought that lies behind something. But when we talk about word for word, what exactly are we talking about? So we have word for word translation, which they're called formal equivalents. Best representation is the King James, and then the New King James, and the New American Standard. And then we have the thought for thought, which is dynamic equivalence. We have the NIV, the ESV. And then we have texts that kind of try to straddle the line. I call them combinations just for the purpose of this. We have the Holman Christian Standard Bible, which is a Baptist translation. And then we have the Revised Standard Version. And then we have paraphrastics, such as the Living Bible, the New Living Translation, somewhat kind of a little deceptive there, and of course the Message. And they all have advantages, they all have disadvantages. Those that are word for word will you really have to think about them sometimes. And those that are thought for thought can sometimes front load an understanding. All translations can actually influence how you interpret the text, which is the reason why we need to understand what goes into an interpretation. Let's look at this graphic right here. It kind of puts everything on a scale. So you have the most literal to the highest paraphrase, with the New American Standard being the most literal word for word. King James, New King James, ESV. NIV is thought for thought, New Living Translation, New Jewish Bible, New Jerusalem, Common English, Living Bible, and of course the Message being the most free in its paraphrase. What's interesting is that how, especially heretical groups, will use one translation as long as it suits them, and they'll change to something else. But that, to kind of front load a little bit for next week, so much of a translation actually informs our interpretation because of where we are and how we use language where we are today. Last year, I wrote, my senior paper was on oneness theology and comparing it to Trinitarian theology. What I found very interesting is that the oneness proponent never referenced original language. He used the King James Version as entirely his text. He never made any argument from the original language. He just he said, this is what it says, this is what it means. You were supposed to take it for granted. And of course, that goes to presuppositions. What are they presupposing? So when we look at a translation, one of the things we need to keep in mind is where it comes from. All translations from one language to another have a source. And modern Bibles, we pull from a lot of different sources. When we look at the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures primarily pull from the Masoretic text. King James was heavily dependent upon the Masoretic text, still is. The oldest text that we knew of the Masoretic text was from the 9th century. We knew it had been around since about the 2nd century. The earliest example we have of it is something called the Engedi Scroll, which was about 35 lines from the book of Leviticus. This was the oldest example. It's 3rd century. And of course, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is approximately 1,000 manuscripts of biblical and non-canonical material, our depth of knowledge just grew exponentially, essentially overnight. And of course, there's been 3 more finds. The most recent find was this year. But there are differences, and this is what's interesting. There's even differences. The Masoretic text is incredibly stable, but it has significant differences from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which, when you compare the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Septuagint, you notice that Septuagint will sometimes have different readings from it, which is in another text we're going to talk about. You might have heard of the Textus Receptus. King James was, when it comes to the New Testament especially, you'll sometimes hear this brought up. King James and its modernized sibling, the New King James, This is a source of printed and collated manuscripts. It's printed text. It's edited text. And it's composed of the 5 editions of Erasmus, one of Stephanus, and one of Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's successor. Beza was Calvin's successor in Geneva. But this is not to be confused with Scrivener's Textus Receptus. A lot of times you'll see people with a blue bound Greek text as Textus Receptus on it. That's actually a reverse translation from what it is Scrivener realized that the King James translators made choices in their translation. And so he said, okay, I'm going to find out what those choices are. Went through the text and then translated the English text into Greek. So he would have an example of one Greek text. It reads nothing. There's no other manuscript that reads like it. None of the composite manuscripts that are used read anything like it. But this was the scholarly source for 200 years when it came to doing translations and studying the text. What's interesting about the King James, and most people don't realize it, but if you have a King James today, it is not a 1611 unless you have a 1611 edition. Most of what you have, we'll find, is a version of the 1769 Blayney, which was an update to the 1611. And you'll either have it in the Oxford or Cambridge, and there's differences between the two. So, if this was the scholarly source for 200 years, what changed? Well, a German scholar by the name of Konstantin von Tischendorf was wanting to, in the 19th century in Germany, where he was at, German rationalism was in full swing. It was destroying any meaningful examination of the text. It denied, it put John in the 3rd century, or in the late 2nd century. Tischendorf said, I'm going there, I'm going to see what I can find. Well, this textual scholar at the monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai Peninsula, he discovered what is known as the Codex Sinaiticus, which is a sister to, but not directly related to, something called the Codex Vaticanus. We brought it back. He made several other important textual discoveries. Well, in 1849, he published the first scholarly text since Beza's edition. So there's about 300 years there. His Novum Testamentum Graece. And this is the grandchild of his work, is what is known as the modern eclectic text. And they come in 3 flavors. You have the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament. You have the United Bible Society text. And then there's what is known as an ecclesiastical text, which is primarily Byzantine. The Byzantine text is the majority text, is the largest. Nestle Aland and UBS reflect the Alexandrian, which is what is represented in Sinaiticus. But what's interesting is that when you look at Sinaiticus, it has what is known as correctors in it. And we can peel back the layers on these correctors, and we can tell where readings changed and where they went from being Alexandrian to Byzantine, which is interesting. That's the majority text. Byzantine. But they reflect the broadest possible spectrum of all manuscripts, and they have what's known as an apparatus, which contains variant readings and locations in the manuscript. Why does this matter? Well, going back to what Bentley said, assurance. We can be sure of what was written by the number of witnesses we have. And any differences that are between those witnesses can be resolved. We're certain of that. We can know what we have is, we can argue about the truth of it, but we know that the text has come to us. This, of course, when we pick up a Bible, we're expecting God to speak to us. And part of the means that God used was intermediaries. Now, does this mean, that because of these issues, we shouldn't trust our translations? And the answer is no. Translation's a tool. It's a tool we use. There is a danger of favoring a particular translation. If that translation is what you're using to leverage your theology, we see it in Mormonism, we see it in Jehovah's Witnesses, we see it in oneness. We see the leveraging of theology, something known as King James onlyism. Our desire for absolute assurance can cause tunnel vision and can cause us to see something new and different as wrong. So what's the takeaway ultimately? You need to know what to look for. And part of the terms used in translating refers to the philosophy of the translation, the source and quality of the manuscripts. So when you pick up a King James, you should automatically know, okay, it's drawing from this tradition. And you can look at it, most of the time have an introduction, and it will say, we're translating this, we're translating that. But if somebody asks you, about a particular translation, you go, well, this goes this way, this is how they were translating. It helps us to pause and think since we can know these things. Also, the fact that we know this, it helps us disarm our enemies, because there's things we now know that they don't. Most of the problems that they're going to bring up are issues with translation and transmission rather than the text itself. Anything they bring up almost always has to do with a translation issue. For instance, what day was Jesus crucified on? One of Bart Ehrman's favorite things to bring up because of the way it's translated in the text. The problem is when you look at the Greek, they say the same thing. It's one reason why I played that video and played as much of it as I did, because some of the arguments he brought up, we only see because we're reading it in translation. Now, if we're careful in reading our translations, sometimes we'll sort these things out. Sometimes we need to dig a little deeper. But most of these are just matters of translation, as well as just general ignorance of the cultures of the ancient Near East. But next week, we're going to kind of see how this all works as we work to apply the text. We look to interpretation. what it is, how it works, how it needs to be done at ground level. So, any questions, any comments?
I missed it somewhere.
Okay.
Last question. The two factors produce the most objections to the Bible.
Right. Transmission and translation are the two factors that cause most objections. How we got it, part of that is the transmission issue. Most people, when they bring up an issue with textual variation or anything like that, it goes to transmission or how it's translated. 99% of the problems that I've seen have to do with translation issues. They don't like how something's translated. And when you explain it to them, they go, well, why couldn't they have said that to begin with? I don't know. I'm not a translator. I don't know what goes through translators' heads. I'm not a mind reader. I do realize that the translator is often trying to convey something. And English, while it's a very useful language, we're hamstrung by it. And if it doesn't fit our thinking where we are right now, I had a guy the other night, it was just inane what he said, because I made the point of saying that when we read the Bible, we have to be thinking. When we're reading, there's things we have to be thinking about. He comes back, well, shouldn't it be clear? And I'm sitting there, and I just, when you read anything, do you think about it while you're reading it? You know, I read all kinds of books. And I've read everything that was, I've read stuff that was written in the 1st century, Bible, 2nd century, 3rd century, all the way up to today. And I realize when I read it, I have to contextualize it. I have to go, okay, what did these people know? Where were they in time? What issues were they speaking to? Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you got to do a little digging around to find out exactly what's going on. I was like that Oneness book that I read. I'm sitting there reading it and I'm going, I don't see that in the text at all. How is he coming to that conclusion? Well, I had to read a little history on him, on the writer. I had to read a little history on Oneness theology in general, where it comes from, and actually read some responses to it from the 3rd century. I mean, this has been around for a while. You know, Council of Nicaea was basically over Oneness doctrine. And you read the canons of Nicaea, and you read Athanasius on the Incarnation, and you read anything Athanasius. You have to keep in mind that sometimes what he's quoting, they might not have had full access to everything.
But sometimes, and I know we're out of time.
Oh, yeah.
We can deal with this next time. But sometimes I think when I hear some of these things, it's almost like all the focus is on that there's problems with the Bible. And that statement you just said about thinking, I understand that, but then when you factor in all these names of people that most of us have never heard of,
Mm-hmm.
It's almost implying, have I got to know all of that to be able to read the Bible and profit from it? And the answer is no, absolutely not.
No.
But I think that the risk is that it can come across like that, and I agree I need to be thinking, but I have to believe that God is superintending that whole process, and I never heard them even say God's involved in this process at all. You know, it's not a purely human thing. Even my own sitting down and reading it is, I agree with you to the extent that I have a different understanding of the Bible only because of my training in seminary. But that's not to imply that the average person on the pew cannot understand the Bible
Right.
because they don't have that same 4 years of training.
Right.
And I think that, that's the risk of coming across that you've got to know all of these details and have read all these books to even be able to understand the Bible. And that's just not.
That's not the case at all. It is simply sometimes just sometimes it's as simple as reading the forward. How many people have actually read the forwards of their Bibles? I have. You'd be surprised what you learn just reading the forward of your Bible. I mean, so that's, a lot of this stuff, it gets sorted out if people just read it.
Take some time.
Take their time and read it. And instead of, and this is one of the biggest things that I see, especially dealing with oneness and reading the oneness materials. When I was writing that paper, they would read something, but they were reading it with the presumption of oneness theology. They weren't trying to derive their theology. They were trying to justify their theology. And so much, which this goes to people picking a particular translation. You take King James only. They have no way to articulate a meaningful defense against a oneness who's using the same translation. Because they're using the same Bible, and because you may not have this background, like I said, just have read the forward of your Bible. A lot of this comes out. The arguments are you can't respond to them.
And a lot of the forward of the Bible is written knowing that the reader is not a scholar that's reading. It's just the average person has bought a Bible.
Right.
And so it's written in a way that takes that technical stuff and
10 or 15 pages that people skip over to get to the book of Genesis has a lot of this information in it.
But it's boiled down so that it's
right. And it's not to say that you have to know it. Sometimes it's just, like I said, just simply reading what you're given and reading it critically and thinking through what's being said. And above all, thinking through your own arguments. Are you imposing an argument, or are you extracting an argument? And that's something that goes next week that we're going to look at. How do we use the tools that we're given? And so all of this to come to this point, just to kind of give you the philosophy and the history that goes, that not necessarily you have to know all this stuff, but that it just gives you, so that when your granddaughter or your grandson comes up to you and goes, why do we believe this? And I mean, just to say it's true, and that's the understatement. But this book has these books have a history of themselves, and they've come to us, and we can say, well, we can be sure of what was written because of this, and we can know it's true because it defines everything else. If you test the like I said, the Bible begins with its own presuppositions. Right up front, Genesis 1, God created all things. And He defines what those things are to do. And so that's the presupposition. It informs everything else. And the fact that it's come through time to us should be that miracle that we thank Him for. All right. Let's go home. Let's have a good week. Let's think about this, and we'll come back in our next session, and we'll work this stuff out.